Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it a minute for people to participate, and I'll start it in about a minute. And for those of you just logging on, joining us, we're just going to wait a little bit, about a minute here. Pardon me. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Trustees Conservation and Action webinar series. My name is Russ Hopping. I'm the lead coastal ecologist here at the Trustees. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you're excited to get an in-depth look at how we care for our special places. Each one of our 122 properties has its own unique history and treasures to offer. And our team of stewards, curators, ecologists, and many others all play a role in bringing these environments to life. Today, you'll hear about the exceptional work we're doing in the Great Marsh to restore this ecosystem so it is more resilient to climate change. These efforts would not be possible without the support of our donors, and we cannot thank them enough. Pardon me. When the world went virtual more than 2 years ago, we launched new online programming like this webinar series in order to stay connected to our members, visitors, and supporters. We have since found that our online webinars help us reach a broader audience, including those who have gained a renewed appreciation for nature and getting outside due to the pandemic. I hope these webinars will inspire you to get out and explore Trustees property and help you learn about our many new projects and initiatives. We believe this work will help us get the next generation outside and build the Trustees of the future. Thank you again for supporting our mission to protect and share the places people love. Please submit questions via the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. David Burdick, my co-presenter from UNH, and I will pause for questions after the presentation. Also, next to the question and answer button, you will see a live transcript option. If you would like to enable closed captions to appear at the bottom of your screen, please select live transcript and show subtitle. Thank you. So with that, I will be starting the presentation. And just so you all know, it's going to be about 35-40 minutes for David and I to run through this presentation. And for those of you who may be already familiar with this project, this is, taking a closer look at restoring the Great Marsh. Some of you may be familiar with us already, and this is going to be an update. We're going to share some of the information that our monitoring has been telling us is happening out there. And some of you, this may be new for, in which case I will be doing an overview of kind of the basics of what we're doing. And of course, we have there we go. There's always a technical glitch. So just kind of for that background to get people up to speed here again, or as a reminder, back in 2016, the Trustees did a coastal vulnerability assessment where we looked at what we felt the impact of sea level rise and storm surge was going to do to our coastal properties. And no surprise, I guess it really highlighted that our beaches and our salt marshes were going to be very vulnerable. And as a result of that, we really looked around to kind of understand, well, what is the state of our salt marsh and what could we do to help it cope with sea level rise? And as a result of that, we came up with a multi-phase project. We started with phase one. We started that back in 2020. That's the 85 acres up at Old Town Hill. That's the blue polygon at the top of that map. And then closely following behind that was phase two, which was 3 additional sites. Those are highlighted in red. Those total 273 acres. And then phase three, which is just over 900 acres, that's all in purple. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this restoration work is going, the status of each one of these phases. And just want to highlight our funders here that have made this work possible. So to recap, or if this is new to you, this is Old Town Hill. So this is phase one. And what you're looking at is the restoration plan for the Salt Marsh. That's the 85 acres there. And the colors are very important here. So the red lines are embankments, and the blue and the green are the ditches that farmers created 100, 200 plus years ago. Much of that infrastructure is still out there, and it's influencing how this marsh functions. It's really impacting the hydrology, and it's very important for a healthy marsh. So the restoration effort here at Old Town Hill is primarily using ditch remediation. And that's where we're harvesting hay adjacent to the ditches and rebuilding all of those green ditches to improve the hydrology. And that's a 3-year process typically. So at this site, the baseline monitoring is done. Second year of monitoring following 3 years of ditch remediation has been completed. And you're going to mostly hear about our results from this site. This site does not have runnels. That is a different technique that I'll talk about here in a second. This is just a timeline to give you a sense of how long these projects take, and we're pretty much right on schedule here. We finished up everything is underlined here in 2022. This season, we're going to complete our 3rd year of monitoring post-baseline data collection at Old Town Hill, and we're going to be doing adaptive management on the ditch remediation. And then we have 2 more years where we're going to be monitoring and doing any additional adaptive management. Phase 2, again, the colors here are the same as phase 1. All of the green, as a reminder, are the ditches we're going to be remediating. But in phase 2, we have added runneling, which I've put a white circle at the bottom of the map there with a little orange squiggly line. That's to highlight that is a runnel, and those orange dots are beneficial reuse of the material that was excavated to create the runnel, which is essentially a shallow ditch, to create nesting islands. So this work, the first year of the runneling was completed about a year ago exactly, and then the first year of ditch remediation was completed in the fall. So we're a little behind phase 1, but underway. Same concept here at Crane Beach. This is 132 acres. If you're familiar with the entrance to Crane Beach, this is the salt marsh on either side as you approach the parking lot that you can see here and the beach. Again, I've highlighted a runnel right here. And then the 4th site is 30 acres on our partner's property. This is a wildlife management area in Newbury that is owned and managed by Mass Wildlife. And this site was a bit wetter than the other site, so it involves a lot more runnels. And those are, again, those orange lines that you see here. All the work has been finished on this site except for a couple of runnels, which will be done starting next week. And then finally, phase 3, which is all of the purple that you see on this map, and phase 2 are the red areas on this map, really just to show you how this all ties together at the landscape scale, how we're building off of each of these phases. Phase 3 does include 141 acres of greenbelt, that's Essex County greenbelt, and then 86 additional acres owned by Mass Wildlife. The design has been completed for this, and some baseline monitoring, primarily the nesting birds, and then we anticipate permitting starting next month. Cross your fingers. So that's kind of to get everybody up to speed on where the various phases are and what we were doing. So the monitoring has been quite extensive, and this is just to show the extent of all of the things we are monitoring, which both David and I are going to talk about here now. So all of the salt marsh has been designated priority habitat for either breeding or foraging terns, both least terns and common terns, and natural heritage, which needed to permit this project because it is in priority habitat, is very interested in understanding how this work may impact foraging and nesting terns. Our monitoring has told us there's absolutely no nesting terns out in the marsh, but we do have nesting least terns on both Plum Island and Crane Beach. They do forage in the salt marsh areas, but what we've discovered is they primarily forage in the larger creeks, which you can see here highlighted in this yellow, and in some cases in the larger pools where there may be some small fish. But pretty much our restoration work is not impacting their breeding, certainly, and their foraging, probably not at all. More important for us is the salt marsh sparrow. This is a small sparrow, brownish bird. If you're familiar with sparrows, it's pretty typical, but I call it the piping plover of the salt marsh because like the piping plover, it's very limited in its habitat, and it needs salt marsh. It's the only place where this bird lives, and Massachusetts supports 10% of the global population, the Great Marsh 5%. And it's a very significant spot for salt marsh sparrow, and some of the funding is coming for that. It's an excellent indicator. If the sparrow's doing well, then the habitat is doing well. And what you're looking at here is just over the 4 sites, so Old Town Hill, Essex, Crane, and then the wildlife management area over the 4 years, telling us that we have sparrows at all 4 of these sites. We chose Old Town Hill initially because, for one of the reasons, because we knew or thought it had a pretty good population of these sparrows, which, by the way, have been declining by 9% a year. That's their range wide. It was listed as a rare species that's protected in Massachusetts in 2020. And the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is potentially listing this next year. So pretty significant spot for these birds. Like any of our biological indicators, particularly wildlife, we're interested in trend data. So over time, we're looking for increases or decreases. Any particular year is not necessarily that critical. So the good news is we have sparrows, and after 3 years of restoration at Old Town Hill, we still have plenty of sparrows there. In addition to sparrows, we're looking at mosquitoes. Everyone wants to know, will our work increase the number of mosquitoes out there? Well, our philosophy is no. And what you're looking at is a 2 forms of monitoring. So the green dots are those spots that the Essex County Mosquito Control District is monitoring along with us. They do this annually, but they're doing it in conjunction with our monitoring, which is based on transects, which you see represented here in red dots. So where the Mosquito Control District goes to and looks for breeding mosquito habitat, we wanted to demonstrate that even the areas that are not currently mosquito habitat will not become breeding habitat over time through our restoration. And that's why we chose this additional monitoring method. So this is, again, for Old Town Hill, 3 years worth of monitoring. If you look at the bottom, you see 1, 2, 3, 4. That can essentially be interpreted as May, June, July, August for those months. And overall, I hope you can see, even though that 2022 spike there looks ominous, it's incredibly small numbers of breeding mosquitoes that we're seeing on these transects. And then by July and August, you can see it's back down to almost nothing. So the good news is this site still is producing incredibly small numbers of mosquitoes, even with 3 years of restoration. More interesting for me as I look at this, as we do the sampling, we use dip cups, and those are little plastic cups at the end of wooden poles that, if they're at each station, if there is water present, and the mosquitoes do need water, we will do 3 dip samples, and that's how we count if there's any larvae. If there's no water to sample, there's no breeding habitat, and we call that a dry site. So if you look over time here, especially for the months of July and August, you can see it's getting drier with each successive year. So there's just not water on the marsh for us to even sample for mosquitoes. So again, that's a good sign, but we're looking for trends. We're going to continue to keep this monitoring going. So switching away from wildlife, The main restoration technique at Old Town Hill has been ditch remediation. And again, this is where hay, the salt marsh hay, is harvested right next to the ditch. We then move that hay into the ditch, secure it, and over a 3-year process, it sequesters all that sediment that's coming in on the daily tides. And the peat, we rebuild the peat and we bring up the bottom of that ditch. So we had 2 goals. One was by year 3, we wanted to see the ditches that we're remediating at least have 25% vegetation within those ditches. So we pretty much met that goal. You can see here 91% of the 128 ditches that were identified for remediation met that goal. The second criteria we were looking for is as we rebuild or heal those ditches from the bottom up, we wanted to bring the depth of the ditch up to within 20 centimeters of the marsh surface. We achieved that on 52% of those ditches. Now, the number's actually better than this. So unlike the vegetation, where we were looking at an overall percentage of vegetation across the entire ditch, the depth we're looking to have be uniform across the entire length of the ditch. So it's not like 48% of these ditches don't have, are failing to meet this depth requirement. It's only a portion of them. And those ditches will receive additional treatment this year. So we hope to see that number dramatically jump up by the end of this growing season. Good news is no sign of erosion anywhere and no invasive species. Those are plants that we're looking for. So runnels, this is that second technique that we have built into phase 2. These are those shallow ditches. So where the ditch remediation just can't drain the marsh from being waterlogged, we have to add these in. So we had a total of 6 of them that were put in last year. So of those 6, we wanted to kind of document their width and depth. Again, these are only about 6 to 8 inches deep by 2 to 3 feet wide. And we wanted to document if they were getting larger over time. The trigger is that if there's after 1 year of these ditches of the runnels adjusting themselves, we anticipated there would be some erosion, that there would, following that, we would only identify a problem if they changed by 25% more. So this coming year, we will now be able to look at how they change, and we're not anticipating them to change very much based upon last year's data, but we've at least established that. So if you're not familiar with what runnels do, this diagram here on the right is really demonstrating that. So on the right side, groundwater has come up to the surface. In some cases, it's at the surface. These plants do not want to grow in standing water and they die. That's what this graph is showing. When you lose the vegetation, the whole system sinks. So that marsh platform drops. That's the wrong direction with sea level rise. What a micro runnel does is it drops that groundwater down 10 to 20 centimeters so that the roots of these plants can now grow in optimum conditions. They're not saturated anymore. They do have access to oxygen. We turn back on that growing, and the peat that salt marsh is built on is up to 80% undecomposed vegetation. So it's critical we have that vegetation to help build this marsh to keep pace with sea level rise. This is an example of what a runnel looks like. So if you think that map that I showed you for Crane with that white circle, this is the runnel. So March 3, when it was created, a couple months later at the beginning of the growing season, and then at the end of the growing season. And hopefully you can see there's really no change. You can even see there's a small bit of peat right there that is still existing right here. So it's showing you after months, there's been very little erosion at this site. It's functioning the way it needs to, and you can see in these pictures that the marsh is less flooded. So the second piece to this is that material that is excavated. We create these nesting islands. There were 20 of them. So you can see here, the goal was after 1 year that these nesting islands would have 30% vegetation on them and no invasive species. So no invasive species for sure. And then at Essex and Crane, we met that goal with flying colors. At the WMA, we had a little bit of a problem. We only had just over a third of them meet this goal. And that's for 2 reasons. One, we had a very high tide that washed some of these nesting islands away before we could secure them. And then the second piece is some of the material was actually excavated from underwater. We already had these pools forming. So the material did not have any existing vegetation in them to really jumpstart that vegetation when the island was created. This is what the islands look like. So again, back to Crane, where we had that runnel. That's what the island looks like in late May. It looks like a giant cow patty, not much happening there yet. And then by the end of October, you can hardly tell it's there. And I just want to draw your attention to all that red. That's Salicornia. That is an annual plant. It's an early successional plant, much like a weed might be, where you have a ball patch in your lawn or something. So that's an excellent sign. That's telling us that the site is drying out enough that this plant can then colonize. And if you even look behind this island, you see some of those dark patches. There's not standing water in there. You can see a little water in the back. So again, this is telling us that the system, we did drop the groundwater down a little bit, and the area is perfect for recolonization by vegetation. And I think Dave will show a little bit more with our data collection, how that's working. I want to draw your attention to these two red texts down here. 94% of our islands pass the elevation. We wanted them to be at or above mean high water. And then our area, we really wanted them to be really no smaller than 7 square meters, and 80% of them passed. The other ones that didn't achieve that is because of, again, that high tide event that eroded a few of our islands away. So with that, that completes my presentation. I am going to turn this over to David, and he is going to continue talking about our data collection.
Well, thanks, Russ. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for tuning in to this webinar. We're really trying to do some exciting work here, trying to approach marshes as sort of an ecosystem indicator of health, but also to try to understand the hydrology of the system so that we can set the hydrology right after so many years of it being impacted by various farming techniques and such. So I'm going to jump in here, I think. Go to the next slide. I'm going to talk to Russ about that. Just overall, and along the east coast of the U.S., many salt marshes are getting a lot wetter as sea level rises, and some of the structures that the farmers have left at these sites have trapped water behind them. And so you can, if you can see in that top right-hand side from 2012, you see there's some water in our Old Town Hill marsh. Some of the areas that are black, it's water, and the green areas are vegetation cover. And we can divide this area up into sub watersheds, and that's the colorful marks on the right, where we see from dark blue to bright red. And the bright red areas have the areas with the most water, and then orange is a little less water, and the dark blue areas have almost no water at all. And we can see that over time, between 2012 and 2018, we have more water on the marsh. I don't know if you can see that in the image with the black versus the green, but when you classify those different sub-watersheds, we can see that there's 2 red squares instead of 1 red square, and there's 4 yellow squares instead of polygons instead of 3 yellow polygons. So the area is definitely getting wetter over time. And during these years, this 80-acre site lost about 3% of its vegetation cover. So about a 3% increase in bare. And that's about 2.5 acres. So it translates to about 2.5 acres of marsh. In the future, when the USDA flies this area again with innate photography, we hope to see some increases in vegetation area from the activities we're doing. So we're trying to replumb the system with surface hydrology to make sure the water doesn't collect and stay in those really wet areas, and that the water doesn't drain too much from the ditched areas. So that's sort of the goal. Next slide. And I'm going to bring you right immediately to water. And so this is all about water, and it's a project to change how water moves through the marsh. And so what we see here are 2 tidal traces of the tides from automatic water level recorders. And we have 3 traces on one graph, and I think we have 4 traces on another graph. So the graph on the left is, you can see the tides go in and out every day in the major tidal creeks, but not so much in the salt marshes. So in the marsh platform itself, it's variable. And the light blue trace is the reference marsh, marshes that where we see the grass is growing really well, good sparrow habitat. So that's our goal of what we want our water to look like in the platform areas. And the orange there is the enhanced drainage. And so it's telling us that the cleaning out of the ditches is working well, and we see that these areas are draining over the tides. You can see the tides vary. There's neap tides and spring tides. So we have the end of a spring tide where we start this trace, and then we go into a neap tide period, and then another spring tide at the end. So we see that these marsh areas are actually flooding over the surface of the marsh during those spring tides, but they're still draining at low tide, which is what we want to see. And that's true for both the right hand and the left hand side. The right hand side is a little less drainage, but that whole area is a wetter area. You say, well, why is this marsh wetter? Well, if you look at the surface of the marsh relative to the surface of the rest of the earth, the marsh is about 1.5 meters above a geodetic datum. And if we look at the right hand side, that marsh surface is 1.35 or 1.4 meters above that datum. So we're missing about 6 inches of elevation in that southern marsh. And that's because historically that marsh was cut off from the tides to a much greater extent. And so a new culvert was put in that site about 15 or 20 years ago. So that marsh is trying to catch up and get higher in elevation. But because of that, the marsh floods a little bit more. So let's turn to our other sites, and we can see we can make a graph or table of how much these areas are getting flooded before and after. Can we get that next one, Russ? So this is Ipswich and Essex, and we followed a couple runnels in Essex and one runnel in Ipswich. And in 2020, on the left-hand side in the red circle, you can see that the flood duration was almost 100% of the time. So these areas where the marsh is being flooded is flooded almost 100% of the time. And so after the runnels were put in these 2 sites in 2022, within the red circles, you can see on the surface of the marsh, it's flooded less than half the time. And in the root zone's getting drained on a daily basis as well. Not quite as much, and that might change over time. We don't know. We don't know the answer to that because these runnels were just put in 2022. So we'll be learning more about that in the future. So how does this translate into this images? So Russ is going to show the next slide, and we'll see the 2 years, 2020 and 22 on the next slide. And we can see that in 2020 in Ipswich, Essex, before the runnel area is in the orange, and you can see that it's always flooded over the marsh surface, which is green. So these marsh areas were chosen because we're losing vegetation because they're always flooded, the vegetation's dying off. And after the runnel in 2022, we can see it starts to drain below the surface. So that's a good sign. We want to see those areas drain and revegetate. So that's what we're planning on for looking at this year. Next slide. This is at Ipswich, at the runnel at Ipswich. You can see it's too flooded in 2020, and afterwards we're getting a little bit of draining in the last part of that trace in 2022. So there's getting a little bit of draining here, but there's not that much draining going on. And so during this period of the month, and this was from the end of September to mid-October of last year. And so we're thinking this may be a site where we might have to adaptively manage. So I think Russ mentioned that that's what we would do in a later year, is look at the results and see if we have to tweak our work a little bit more. So this runnel looks like maybe it needs to be tweaked. We're going to take another look at it this year, and we'll get together with Jeff and Russ, and we'll make a decision on what has to happen there for that marsh to function better. Next slide. Oh, we also put benchmarks in the marsh. This is all about, it's not just about the flooding of the water. That's what we're trying to control, but we want the marsh to grow in elevation to meet that, to meet the challenge of increased sea level. And so there's a picture of myself and a technician with me working, standing on the marsh with two boards and using a rotating jackhammer to drive in rods. And then we can take measurements around those rods and look at how the surface changes over time. We can do that in the next slide. We see there's six of these. There's two of them at really good sites that are reference marshes where we want to get to. We have two in ditch remediation areas and two in ditch in drainage enhancement areas, the areas where we've cleaned out ditches where it's too wet. And we can see on the left-hand side that there's new sediments, there's new inorganic sediments brought in by the water being laid on the marsh surface. And so we're getting between 2 and 6 millimeters over almost 3 years of new sediments on the marsh surface. So these are actively growing. And if we look at the surface of the marsh overall, we can see that that's happening as well. So relative to the geodetic datum that we talked about before, the marsh is growing in elevation. The negative part is sea level rise is growing. So the next slide shows that data amassed. So we have on the left-hand side drainage enhancement, and then we show the ditch remediation sites and the reference area sites. So those are averaged up for the time, and we can see that the marsh building, which for the drainage enhancement is very exciting. It's almost 4 millimeters a year, which is really close to sea level rise. And it's combined of this new sediments on the marsh surface as well as below ground growth. And that's what we're really trying to encourage here, is more plant growth to build up the marsh. So we passed our monitoring milestones for year 1 and 2 at 2 millimeters a year, and we're hoping to see more growth the next year. Next slide. And these are very complicated. If you were a little bit daunted by the previous ones, even I'm daunted by these slides. These slides have a lot of information in them. And so these are essentially a stacked bar chart. So if we look on the ground in front of us, we're standing on the marsh and we look down, we can imagine that there's certain percentages of cover. And so this is a one stacked bar chart averaging for 2019, all the ditch remediation sites we went to. And here it is for 2021, and here it is for 2022. The main thing I want to get across here is we have good vegetation and recovery, good vegetation at the site to start with, and we still have good vegetation at the site. And that is included for the ditch remediation sites, the enhanced drainage sites, and the reference sites. So this changes in plants from year to year, but it's not showing any loss of vegetation. We're not losing vegetation. We're not getting a lot of bare cover or anything like that. So things are going well. The next slide shows the centers and edges of ditches, and the centers and edges of ditches are doing well as well. And the remediated ditch centers, we expect these to be slowly filling in. So they've lost 70%, 71% unvegetated in 2019, and now it's 61% in 2022. We expect that number to go down even further in 2023. Okay, I think that covers it. It's 12:34, so we're 1 minute early, and I think there's time for questions. I'm going to hand it back to you, Russ. Thanks.
Yes, thank you both so much, David and Russ. We do have some time for questions. If anybody listening would like to submit any questions, please do so by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we do have a couple here. One to start for Russ. Other states have used sediment placement to raise the marsh. Why hasn't the trustees tried this approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. So sediment placement, some people will call it thin layer placement. This is where material is dredge material or something like that is then distributed out on top of the marsh platform to give it that additional elevational gain. The quick and easy answer is it's virtually impossible to do that in Massachusetts under the current regulatory system. But the good news is that's something that may be needed in the future. We think we need to fix the hydrology first. And then if that doesn't work, then we may be able to think about some other actions in the future. But we really have to fix the hydrology first and give the marsh its chance to keep pace with nature, with sea level rise, rather than start putting this material out there. That there can be consequences with that. If you put too much, it can smother the vegetation. It can also be very heavy and cause the marsh to sink. So it sounds very simple, and other states have tried this, and there's examples of some success, but lots of examples of some caution and or failure as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Couple more questions here. How much were the dry readings affected by the drought last summer versus the remediation efforts?
I think that's to you, Russ, for the mosquito dips that were dry.
Right. So doing mosquitoes, or maybe even we look at some aquatic plants as well as some other things out there. Weather's a big factor. So 2 years ago, if you all remember, it was an incredibly wet season, and it seemed like every week we were getting thunderstorms, and there was a lot of moisture on the marsh. And then last year, yeah, we had this extreme drought, and all of the Great Marsh was in this belt of extreme drought. We actually thought we were going to see more impacts, more areas kind of burning up, so to speak, but we didn't see that. If I could go back and look at that for the mosquitoes in particular, you will see at, let's see, it was August, July and August, those last 2 months in my graph, you will see that there was hardly any sites that had moisture on them with the dip station. That was likely being influenced by that severe drought. So all the more reason why we have to track these things over time, not only seasons, but over years, so we can show this trend. And any of these anomalies, like a dry year or a super wet year, the impact of that particular year on the data gets less. So we end up seeing the real trend.
Thank you so much. Another one, do you have an estimate of how much carbon has been sequestered now by the Great Marsh, and a guess on how much will remediation impact the sequestration?
That's a great question. I think probably there's a long-term ecological study site that the Great Marsh is part of, that's led by the Marine Biological Labs in Woods Hole, and that's LTER, the Long-Term Ecological Research Site. So they have estimates of how much, I think they have estimates of how much carbon is in the marsh, and we don't know what these activities will do to the sequestered carbon that's being stored. We will be able to, because we put in marker horizons in the marsh, we'll be able to sample those. I think we have to give it at least 5 years, but after 5 years, we can sample those and get an estimate of the added carbon in this marsh system.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I did highlight that the peat is up to 80% undecomposed plant material. That's all carbon. So we now know that these salt marshes are sequestering a lot more carbon, I think, per acre than, say, a forest does, significantly so. So all the more reason to keep what we have instead of releasing all that stored carbon. But again, another benefit of seeing this restoration take place so that we can sequester even more carbon so this marsh can keep pace with sea level rise.
Right. I wanted to bring this up at the beginning of the webinar. I didn't quite know how to do it, and you did a nice job getting very close to it, Russ. But one of the things about these salt marshes, the hydrology that they've been left with, that we've sort of inherited from our forefathers, is some areas are too wet, and those can cause carbon loss. They'll collapse and decompose, and the carbon will go to the atmosphere. So that's bad. And some areas are so overditched, they're too dry. And because they're too dry, oxygen gets into the peat, and that causes carbon loss. So our whole effort in this marsh is to change surface hydrology to get into the Goldilocks zone. I think Russ coined this term. We want the systems.
You can borrow it then.
We want these systems to be flooded by the tides, but we don't want them to be too flooded, and we don't want them to be too drained. So we want them to have sort of what we were hoping would be sort of a more natural flooding draining cycle in the future by changing the surface hydrology with our work. And it actually goes back to the first question from Priscilla that asked about the drought. Well, these are tidal systems, so we expect these tides to bring water in, even though there's a drought happening and there's not a lot of rainfall. The tides will bring the water in and out. And it's those areas that are where the water's trapped that are really hit the worst. So where the water's trapped, it really doesn't change the dippings because they're still going to be wet. But that water is going to dry so much that the salinity is going to go up. It's going to kill the vegetation. And again, we're going to have more loss of marsh. So the drought definitely figures into the loss of marsh. But I think one of the cool things about wetlands in general is that as they evolve, and these systems have evolved to 2 meters of peat, as they evolve, that peat sort of mollifies the extremes in the system. It really protects the ecosystem from extremes like extremes in drought. So it's really an interesting system to look at ecologically.
Excellent. Thank you both. Another one here. How are your targets set for the different areas? Is it target species, net primary production, hydrological functions? That's the question.
Another great question. I'll take a quick shot and then I'll hand it over to Russ.
Yeah.
We want all the areas that in that site, like for Old Town Hill, just to take Old Town Hill as an example, we would want most all of that marsh, except the areas next to those largest creek systems, to be high marsh, to be functional high marsh with lots of Spartina patens, Disticus, Juncus, the high marsh grasses that we recognize in this photograph that we're looking at right now with the questions. So the foreground of the photograph, we want all that whole area of Old Town Hill to be looking like that. And so that's our goal, because we don't have that, there wasn't low marsh there. So some areas have low marsh. And so in the mid ground of the photograph we're looking at right there, there's some low marsh areas, and those are fine. But in our area at Old Town Hill, we just have high marsh. So that's what we're shooting for. Some areas like in Ipswich or Essex, we may have low marsh areas, and we will just probably won't do much to those low marsh areas because they're flooded and drained on a daily basis. That's one of the, almost like a definition of low marsh, flooded and drained on a daily basis. That's what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uses in their counting of tidal marshes, because they split the low marsh from the high marsh. And so if it's flooded and drained daily and if the water's not trapped, it's low marsh. And we're not really focusing on the low marsh work at all. We're really focusing on how water moves to the high marsh. These are the areas that were really farmed. These are the areas targeted by the farmers to put these embankments up, to freshen their systems, to drive up the productivity for their cattle, for cattle food fodder. Russ, you got any?
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, your point about the high marsh is spot on. I mean, it really is all about what you see in the fore of this image. And right now, the Great Marsh, or at least historically, it has been 80% of those 16,000 acres of the Great Marsh have been high marsh and 20% low marsh. We want to keep as much of that as possible. It's the high marsh where the salt marsh sparrow breeds. So again, we monitor for salt marsh sparrow populations. If the populations are doing well, we can certainly infer something about the habitat quality. Likewise, if it's subsiding due to waterlogging or oxidation, it's converting into lower marsh or more open habitat, such as standing water or mud. So that's where we're looking at that unvegetated versus vegetated ratios with all those colorful patches on the marsh. It's all about that vegetation, turning it back on. So all of our metrics are really geared towards trying to push this system or save this system, but then intervene so we stop that subsidence and allow the system to build an elevation and build robust high marsh plant communities.
Excellent. And we have one final question here today. How much maintenance will be required after the restoration is complete?
Yeah, well, I can start, and maybe if there's something you want to add, David, but I mean, what we're using here is a suite of nature-based techniques. And we're choosing that for a variety of reasons. One, they're low impact, and we want nature to do all the heavy lifting. If we can kind of correct the natural processes, then the theory here is that this system will be able to take care of itself. So once we restore that hydrology, the hope is that we'll need very little maintenance. Unlike, for example, if we did have thin layer deposition or sediment placement as a tool, if we don't correct the hydrology, at some point you're going to have to keep doing that over and over again, because it's really a Band-Aid approach. So the idea, everything we're doing here, from how we're taking our time to rebuild the ditches to the design of the runnels, is all intended to be extremely low maintenance or no maintenance. But the monitoring will tell us that. We may discover 5-10 years out that it's working, but we need a little more sediment in the system, in which case we'll look for that plan B, and we've started to do that already with a technique called mud engines. It's based on a concept over in Europe where they pile a bunch of sand up on the beach and let nature, erode that sand and put it where it needs to be. We're not there yet. And David, you can probably talk a lot more about that than I can, but that's the hope. We'll be able to have some form of, again, low maintenance techniques that allow nature, again, to do the heavy lifting, even if we do need to do some form of maintenance.
That sounds good, Russ. I don't have much to add to that.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we're trying to do this right now with the four main partners who own 50% of the salt marsh. That's 8,000 acres. We're well on our way, and our partners have projects that are lined up as well. That's State Mass Wildlife and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The goal is ultimately 16,000 acres or close to it. So you can imagine it needs to be relatively maintenance free at that scale. Otherwise, we're just going to be consumed with having to, constantly unclog things. And if that's just not really an option at that scale. So we've designed it up front to be very low maintenance.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both of you for today's webinar. Russ, if you could close the webinar today for us, that would be great. Thank you.
And I will do that. So just want to thank you all again so much for joining us today. For all webinar recordings in this series and to register for future webinars, I just wanted to remind folks they can visit thetrustees.org/webinars. And again, everything you heard about today would not be possible without our donors, especially top supporters like our Founders Circle members. If you are not yet Founders Circle and would like to find out more, please visit our website or give us a call. So thank you again for joining us today. It's been our pleasure to present on a topic that we're very proud to be presenting on, and for investing in our mission and for believing in a brighter future. So thank you very much.